Near-death experiences, what people see, and why medicine can't ignore it. Near-death experiences. Why the real fight is when they happen. A patient survives cardiac arrest, opens their eyes, and insists something happened somewhere else. They describe calm, brightness, voices, a boundary, sometimes a panoramic replay of life, and sometimes terror and emptiness. The public argument usually jumps straight to the big metaphysical question: proof of an afterlife or a dying brain hallucinating. But the more decisive question is simpler and tougher. When exactly did the experience occur? During the deepest shutdown or during the brain's unstable transition back? The story turns on whether near-death experiences are generated during the brain's final collapse or during its reboot back toward consciousness. Key points. Near-death experiences, NDEs, often cluster around a familiar set of motifs: out-of-body perspective, movement through darkness, bright light, encounters, and a point of no return. Not all NDEs are peaceful. A meaningful minority are distressing, featuring fear, isolation, void-like non-existence, or hellish imagery. The core pattern shows up across cultures, but the characters and settings often shift with religion, language, and local ideas about death and judgment. The biggest constraint in the science is timing. People report memories after recovery, but the brain state during the event is hard to pin down precisely. Modern resuscitation research is starting to separate experiences into categories tied to CPR, early recovery, and dreamlike states, suggesting more than one pathway can produce an NDE-like report. Background. A near-death experience is a remembered episode, reported after a close brush with death or a perceived life-to-threatening crisis. It is not one single thing. It is a family of experiences with overlapping features, ranging from dreamlike scenes to vivid, structured narratives with strong emotion and lasting impact. Researchers often use standardized tools to separate NDEs from general confusion, delirium, or stress reactions. One of the best known is the Grayson scale, a structured set of questions that captures typical cognitive, emotional, and transcendent features. Two realities shape everything that follows. First, NDEs are usually studied through self-report after the fact, not direct recording during the moment. Second, near-death is a messy biological boundary, not a clean on-off switch. Cardiac arrest, severe hypoxia, anesthesia complications, syncope, fainting, and coma can all produce altered consciousness, and they do not all do it in the same way. The tunnel problem. Why one image shows up across stories and eras. People commonly report a shift in perspective, sometimes described as leaving the body. Unusual clarity, altered time, intense emotion, and a sense of movement through darkness toward light. Some report meeting deceased relatives or other beings, hearing voices, or reaching a boundary they cannot cross. One reason the motifs repeat is that the brain does not generate experience like a camera. Under extreme threat, it becomes a prediction machine under pressure, trying to form a coherent world model from degraded input. That pressure can amplify archetypal features: a central light as a salient target, a tunnel as compressed visual space, and a narrative of movement as the mind tries to explain radical bodily change. The stakeholder tension is immediate in clinical settings. Patients want their account taken seriously. Clinicians want to avoid reinforcing delusions. Researchers want clean categories. The constraint is that everyone is describing a private event that feels more real than real, often with high confidence. Competing brain models, REM intrusion, oxygen debt, and anesthesia awareness. There is no single accepted mechanism that explains every feature of every NDE. Multiple pathways can plausibly converge on a similar story. One model ties NDE features to REM intrusion, dream physiology breaking into wakefulness, because REM states can produce paralysis, vivid imagery, and a sense of presence. Another cluster of models focuses on disrupted brain chemistry during oxygen deprivation and reperfusion, blood flow returning, which can produce hallucination-like experiences, distort time, and intensify emotion. A third, often overlooked pathway is anesthesia awareness and related perioperative phenomena, where people may perceive fragments of the environment under sedation and later weave them into a larger narrative. The practical scenario split looks like this. In one path, a person has a dreamlike, internally generated experience driven by physiology under threat. In another, they capture real sensory fragments, voices, pressure, movement, and later integrate them. In a third, both happen, and the memory becomes a fused story. The clues for telling these paths apart are the medical situation, like CPR, surgery, or fainting, the amount of sedatives used, and any specific details that can only be known through actual experience. The culture overlay, why heaven looks local and judgment varies. Across cultures, many reports share structural elements, unusual clarity, separation from the body, encounters, and a boundary. But culture can change the cast, the setting, and what the experience is interpreted to mean. Some cross-cultural work suggests that certain features emphasized in Western accounts, like a panoramic life review, may be less prominent or differently framed in some non-Western reports. Japanese accounts, for example, have been discussed as differing in how light is interpreted and whether it is interacted with, and some non-Western reports emphasize different metaphors, different authorities, and different moral frameworks. This does not mean culture causes it in a simple way. It means culture supplies the narrative grammar. Under extreme uncertainty, the brain reaches for the most available templates to explain what is happening. Researchers' constraint is that language and belief are part of how the memory becomes reportable. The measurement trap, dead on paper, active in networks. The boldest claims often hinge on a phrase like "my brain wasn't working, but I was conscious." The challenging part is that clinical labels do not map cleanly onto moment-by-moment neural reality. Cardiac arrest can produce severely reduced brain perfusion, but CPR can restore partial flow, and resuscitation can create unstable windows where networks flicker back online. Even if the person is unresponsive, internal awareness is still possible. And even if the brain later shows little activity, that does not tell you what happened earlier, during collapse, or during reperfusion. Modern resuscitation research is starting to separate experiences into distinct categories. Some occur as patients emerge during CPR, some in the early post-to-resuscitation period. Some are dreamlike, and some are described as a recalled experience of death. That classification matters because it suggests more than one biological route to the same kind of story. The veridical claim stress test. What would actually count as a hit? Prominent examples often circulate as veridical cases, reports where a person seems to describe real details from the room, despite being unresponsive. These stories are powerful because they would, in principle, force a rethink of assumptions about consciousness and perception. The problem is proof standards. A convincing case needs tight time locking. When exactly did the perception occur? Strong controls against ordinary sensory access, independent documentation of the target details, and replication across settings. Many famous accounts are either disputed on timing grounds, vulnerable to ordinary perception during anesthesia or recovery, or documented in ways that make alternate explanations hard to rule out. A science-forward scenario is not believe or debunk. It is building protocols where a correct hit would be unambiguous, and where misses are still informative rather than embarrassing. What most coverage misses. The hinge is timing bias. Most near-death experiences are remembered after recovery. So the brain may be building a coherent story during the transition back to consciousness, not during the deepest shutdown. Mechanism. When networks reboot, fragments of sensation, emotion, and dreamlike imagery can be integrated into a single narrative that feels continuous. That integration changes incentives for interpretation. It makes "I experienced this" while dead feel obvious to the experiencer, while making it scientifically slippery, unless the experience can be time-locked to physiology. The signposts to watch are concrete. More studies that combine continuous brain monitoring during CPR with structured interviews soon after recovery and protocols that can separate CPR period perception from post-resuscitation reconstruction. Why this matters. In the short term, this is about patient care. People who report NDEs often carry the memory for years. Some feel comforted. Others feel shaken, ashamed, or frightened, especially after distressing experiences. If clinicians dismiss the report, patients may stop sharing critical mental health information. Clinicians run the risk of unintentionally reinforcing confusion during vulnerable recovery periods if they affirm an interpretation too strongly. In the long term, the issue is a consciousness science problem with real stakes, because resuscitation medicine is improving. More people are surviving cardiac arrest. That creates more opportunities to study the boundary states between unresponsiveness and awareness. The main consequence follows a because line. Because NDEs sit at the intersection of physiology, memory, and meaning, progress depends less on debating metaphysics and more on measuring timing, networks, and narrative formation with harsh controls. Real-world impact. A cardiac arrest survivor becomes anxious and sleepless after a distressing void-like experience, but avoids telling clinicians because they fear being labeled delusional. A patient recovering from intensive care hears staff conversations and later reports them as part of an NDE narrative. The family interprets it as supernatural certainty, while the patient mainly needs trauma-informed support. A hospital team adopts a simple intake question. Did anything unusual happen in your awareness while you were unconscious? And identifies patients who would benefit from early psychological follow-up rather than silent rumination. A research unit runs a rigorous awareness protocol during CPR and finds that most experiences cluster around the recovery window, shifting the field from philosophy-first claims to measurement-first models. The next decade of death science. Proof standards, better instruments, fewer myths. The core dilemma is not whether people are lying. It is about whether a private experience can be pinned to public physiology without flattening its meaning for the person. The methodological dilemma arises. Either research continues to rely on retrospective stories and culture war debates, or it evolves into a more precise science that maps transition states such as collapse, CPR, reperfusion, and recovery to interviews designed to minimize memory contamination. Watch for larger, multi-site studies that time-lock reports to monitoring, distinguish dreamlike states from external perception, and publish protocols in advance, so hits and misses both carry scientific weight. The historical significance of this moment is that death is increasingly a reversible process, and that makes the last minutes of consciousness a testable frontier, not just a mystery.